Welcome to NTD Evening News. Our top story tonight, President Trump signing an order to start gutting the education department. What will happen to student loans and Pell Grants, and what a Republican governor tells NTD about how this order will impact schools in his state. Iris Tao at the White House. Israel on high alert as terrorists from the Gaza Strip launched their first rocket attack since fighting resumed. And afterwards, the Houthis in Yemen also fired a missile towards the country. Jason Perry reports. U.S. officials are set to hold separate meetings with representatives from Ukraine and Russia on Monday. Arian Pazdar has what they're scheduled to discuss as the two countries are set to implement a partial ceasefire. The Coast Guard captures a record-breaking amount of illegal drugs south of the U.S. border. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem delivers remarks in Florida. Jason Blair brings us the highlights. California is scrambling with a $1 billion Medicaid shortfall that could leave millions without coverage. Christina Corona brings us the latest on how state budget decisions and potential federal funding cuts might impact health care for many.
This is NTD Evening News, live from our global headquarters in New York City. Here's Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. President Trump starting the process of dismantling the Department of Education with an executive order today. He vows to preserve key funding and programs, but also signals Congress to go further to gut the department completely. Joining us now live is NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao. Good evening, Iris. What is the president's rationale behind this move and what it means for students nationwide?
Good evening to you, Tiff. So a major reason that President Trump says behind today's EO is that he thinks individual states, as opposed to the federal government, can understand and handle students' education more effectively. He's also been complaining about what he calls an exploding budget for the Department of Education, especially as students' performance is not getting better. Watch.
70% of eighth graders are not proficient in either reading or in math, 70%. 40% of fourth graders lack even basic reading skills, can't read. Students in our public elementary and middle schools score worse in reading today than when the department opened.
At today's signing ceremony, there were kids and parents, teachers, as well as local leaders and governors. And President Trump, meanwhile vows to preserve key programs and funding, for example, for low-income students with Pell Grants and also for special education. It comes, though, as he also signals Congress to give him the support needed to completely shut down the department, as his EO today only narrows it down much.
Beyond these core necessities, my administration will take all lawful steps to shut down the department. We're going to shut it down and shut it down as quickly as possible. It's doing us no good.
And when it comes to how exactly today's order will impact public schools in different states, and Texas Governor Greg Abbott told NTD that one is that they will ramp up funding for both schools and teachers who are going to get a raise, and they're also going to improve the curriculum to focus more on math and reading. Back to you, Tiff.
And Iris, today, President Trump also announced an upcoming deal with Ukraine. Tell us more about that.
Sure. So it comes just a day after President Trump talked to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky for about an hour on the phone. And after the White House told us yesterday that have already moved beyond the minerals deal. But today, during the signing ceremony, President Trump announced that he will be very soon signing a deal when it comes to Ukraine's rare earth minerals. Watch.
We're also signing agreements in various locations to unlock rare earths and minerals and lots of other things all over the world, but in particular Ukraine. We're doing very well with regard to Ukraine and Russia, and one of the things we are doing is signing a deal very shortly with respect to rare earths with Ukraine, which they have.
Meanwhile, we're also watching the development when it comes to another proposal, which is when Trump told Zelensky on the phone that he wants the U.S. to own some Ukrainian power plants, including nuclear power plants. That, he says, is another form of protection for Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Back to you.
All right, Iris, thanks for those updates. U.S. officials are set to hold separate meetings with Ukrainian and Russian officials in Saudi Arabia on Monday. The two countries agreed to a partial truce. Now the details have to be worked out. NTD's international correspondent Arian Pazdar has the war update, starting with the battlefield.
4 people are reported wounded after a Russian drone attack in eastern Ukraine between Donetsk and Kharkiv. First responders attended to civilians while taking cover from incoming drones. Meanwhile, in Russia, this video shows a Ukrainian drone attack on Russia's strategic bomber base in Engels. The base dates back to early Soviet times. It holds nuclear-capable heavy strategic bombers, known unofficially as White Swans. Now, this comes as President Trump keeps trying to end the fighting between Russia and Ukraine. And the Trump administration is set to meet with officials of both Russia and Ukraine in Saudi Arabia on Monday. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed the meeting on Thursday.
There will be a meeting between Ukraine and America, and then some shuttle diplomacy, America with Russia, or it might be some meetings in parallel.
The meeting comes after Russia and Ukraine agreed to a limited ceasefire on energy infrastructure, valid for 30 days. Zelensky says a major topic on Monday will be creating a list of objects that will be counted as energy and civilian infrastructure, so both sides are on the same level. And also in terms of energy, on Wednesday, the White House proposed a solution to protect Ukrainian energy plants.
United States could be very helpful in running those plants with its electricity and utility expertise. American ownership of those plants would be the best protection for that infrastructure and support for Ukrainian energy infrastructure.
One of the most important facilities is a nuclear plant in southern Ukraine, currently controlled by Russia. On Thursday, Zelensky commented on the possibility of the U.S. running that plant.
President Trump asked me what I think about this power plant. I told him that it won't work unless it is under Ukrainian control. It is illegal. It won't be able to work.
Zelensky says it can't work because the plant is state-owned. International organizations recognize it as being Ukrainian, and the staff are Ukrainian citizens receiving their salaries from the Ukrainian government. Arian Pazdar, NTD News.
Sirens sounded in Israel today after rockets were fired from the Gaza Strip in what could be the first such attack since the fighting resumed. Sirens sounded again later after a missile was fired from Yemen. NTD's Jason Perry has the war update.
Sirens rang out in Israel on Thursday after an apparent rocket attack was launched from the Gaza Strip. Israeli forces say they detected 3 rockets that were fired from the territory, and that the Israeli Air Force intercepted one of them and 2 others fell into open areas. That is apparently the first such attack from the Gaza Strip since fighting recently resumed between Israel and Hamas. At the same time, residents in Israel have been protesting and voicing their opposition to the war. Israeli police sprayed water cannons at protesters gathered outside of the home of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who recently instructed Israeli forces to resume operations in the Gaza Strip.
We're very, very worried that our country is becoming a dictatorship, and we think our government is not serving the people of Israel and is not thinking of the important things that have to happen here.
And an Israeli soldier was seen confronting one of the protesters, whose father-in-law is still being held hostage in the Gaza Strip.
If we say something, it's against them, it's against the soldiers, but it's not against the soldiers, it's against our government that betrayed our people and the civilians of Israel and the soldiers.
Meanwhile, in the Gaza Strip, residents were seen inspecting the damage of an overnight Israeli airstrike, and a mother said her daughter was killed in the strike.
What is the fault of the children? These are children. What is their fault?
Netanyahu recently addressed civilian casualties after Israel resumed operations in the Gaza Strip.
Israel does not target Palestinian civilians. We target Hamas terrorists. And when these terrorists embed themselves in civilian areas, when they use civilians as human shields, they're the ones who are responsible for all unintended casualties.
And sirens sounded again in Israel on Thursday, this time due to a missile fired by Houthi terrorists in Yemen. A Houthi spokesman said the missile was aimed at Israel's main airport. However, Israel said its Air Force intercepted it before it crossed into Israeli territory. And the U.S. military reported shooting down a Houthi attack drone. And on Thursday, residents in Yemen were seen inspecting the damage of a reported U.S. airstrike. This comes as the U.S. forces say they are continuing 24/7 operations against the Iran-backed group in Yemen. Jason Perry, NTD News.
A researcher at Georgetown University has been detained by immigration authorities for allegedly spreading Hamas propaganda. That's according to the man's lawyer. The lawyer says Badar Khan Suri, an Indian national, was detained outside his Virginia home by immigration agents. The lawyer says Suri was taken to Louisiana and is awaiting a date in immigration court. A spokesperson for the Department of Homeland Security said yesterday that Suri had been spreading, quote, Hamas propaganda and promoting anti-Semitism on social media. The department alleges Suri had a connection to a senior Hamas advisor. Georgetown University said it's not aware of Suri engaging in any illegal activity and has not received a reason for his detention. A federal judge ruled today that Suri can't be deported from the U.S. without further action from the court. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem announces a record cocaine seizure south of the U.S. border. NTD correspondent Jason Blair reports.
Today is a historic day.
Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem, along with the U.S. Coast Guard, announced a, quote, unprecedented seizure of $517 million worth of illegal drugs, mostly consisting of cocaine.
Since the 20th of January, the U.S. Coast Guard, working with others, has seized over 80,000 pounds of drugs.
That means that fewer families are going to be torn apart by addiction, that fewer lives are going to be lost to overdoses, that communities will be safer, and fewer resources will be at the hands of dangerous, violent cartels that seek to do all of us harm.
Secretary Noem says President Trump is making good on his promise to make America safe again.
And today we're here to recognize and to witness another milestone in his mission to protect our borders, to protect our communities, and to stop the flow of illicit drugs and trafficking into the United States of America.
Cocaine is primarily produced in Colombia and then trafficked into Mexico and the U.S. by sea. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention report that cocaine overdose deaths have been consistently rising the past 2 decades. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the main reason for this is cocaine producers are mixing fentanyl into the drug. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Jason Blair, NTD News.
And 3 Venezuelan nationals connected to Laken Riley's killer are said to be deported. 2 of them are brothers of Jose Ibarra, who was sentenced to life in prison for Riley's murder. The other is Ibarra's former roommate. The Justice Department says all 3 have pleaded guilty to possessing fake green cards and will be turned over to ICE. 22-year-old nursing student Laken Riley was murdered last year while jogging at the University of Georgia. California's Medicaid program is facing a major financial crisis with a multi-billion-dollar funding gap that could impact health coverage for millions. NTD's Christina Corona has more on the growing challenge and how the state is responding.
California's Medicaid program is facing a $6.2 billion budget shortfall, which could impact health care coverage for at least 15 million people. Last year, the state expanded free health care to all low-income adults, including undocumented immigrants. California recently extended Medi-Cal to all low-income adults regardless of immigration status. But more people signed up than expected, adding $2.7 billion in extra costs. Other rising costs, such as pharmacy prices and more older adults enrolling, also added to the shortfall. To keep Medicaid running, the Newsom administration borrowed over $3 billion earlier in March. And on Monday, Governor Gavin Newsom requested an additional $2.8 billion loan tone from state lawmakers. But on Tuesday, Newsom said he won't cut coverage for immigrants despite the large budget concerns. Lawmakers say the crisis is fixable, but cuts to federal Medicaid funding by Congress could make California's budget problems even worse. If that happens, the state might have to reduce coverage, limit new enrollments, or raise taxes. But Republicans argue that Californians shouldn't have to pay for what they call reckless financial mistakes of Democrats and that it's unfair to taxpayers. Elon Musk recently claimed on Fox Business that immigration is straining Social Security and potentially leading to voter fraud. He says programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid should be cut. Musk claimed Democrats use these benefits to attract illegal immigrants and turn them into voters. California offers free health care to over a third of its 39 million residents. Lawmakers will vote in April on whether to approve more funding. Reporting from the city of El Monte, Christina Corona, NTD News.
Coming up, President Trump is authorizing coal to be used for energy production. Is it cost-effective compared to renewables? And what about pollution? Kevin Hogan brings us a data report on this power source. Greenpeace hit with a massive lawsuit in order to pay nearly $670 million over Dakota Access Pipeline protests. More on the case. And the Trump administration pushes the deadline to end congestion pricing for New York's Transportation Authority. Our legal correspondent Arnie Richards reports after the break. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. President Trump is unleashing coal energy for electricity production. He calls it beautiful, clean coal, but he hasn't given more details. Our data reporter Kevin Hogan brings us a closer look.
From an economic standpoint, yes. From an environmental standpoint, that's more of a mixed answer. But first, how much coal is there underground in the United States? Well, there's enough coal to last 422 years, so several centuries, a lot of coal to tap into, and that's what President Trump wants to do. That's according to the Energy Information Administration as of last year. So you talk about the advantages of coal. It provides a base load electricity. You're going to still get power from a coal plant when the wind is not blowing and when the sun's not out. And it's relatively a cheap energy source, and it also has a lot of infrastructure already built. So that's part of the advantages. And when you look at the amount of electricity that the United States has gotten from coal over, say, the last several decades, and this is according to the EIA, you see that coal peaked out at about 2 billion megawatt hours in the 2000s. So a megawatt hour, that's about enough power to power 200 homes for an hour, right? So you got 2 billion of those, and then it's dropped off more recently. What replaced that? Well, it's natural gas. As you can see, that share has been growing, actually ballooning in the early part of this century. And then also, when you add all this up, you see nuclear and renewables and all these others, they take up some of that share, but mostly it's that natural gas and coal has been dwindling. But as you can see, in 2000, that's almost about half of all the 4 billion megawatt hours that the United States was consuming, and that was coming from coal, right? Now you drill down further into this and you see that the coal, it basically makes up maybe about a sixth of the energy, and that's right now. This is recent information about 2022, again, the EIA source. So natural gas is covering about a third of what's happening right now. You get maybe a quarter from, or about a fifth from nuclear and a fifth from renewables. So those are still in use, but Trump wants coal to make a comeback. All right, so what about the cost? Well, the cost of this energy, according to the EIA, is very cheap for coal. It's almost, it's just about, let's say, it's about $20 per megawatt hour. So that's on the lower end. Something that's cheaper, natural gas. They say, that, again, this is a federal agency, very reliable source, giving us the cold hard facts on the cost. And then these other renewables, you got solar, geothermal, wind, hydro. Those are a little bit more expensive, getting up to about 60. So that could be about 2 or 3 times as expensive as coal. And then you got nuclear, a little more expensive, probably because all those regulations more recently. Biomass, that's your methane from your landfills. And then you got offshore wind, which is the most expensive, right? So you look at how these prices have changed over time. You're going back from 2010 up to 2020. This is the cost of coal fuel. So again, you have to build the coal plant, but then to run it, you got to fuel it with coal, right? So that's over a little bit over $20 per megawatt hour for that coal fuel. Natural gas fuel, pretty similar. It's come down a little bit, but you see that wind energy used to be a lot more expensive. That's over $100 per megawatt hour, but that's come down, and then this, according to Lazard, that's come down to just about $40. And then also solar used to be very expensive, over $200 per megawatt hour, coming down to about 40. We're going to zoom in on that specific zone right here just so you can see a breakdown of that. Again, these numbers are being disputed. This Lazard number, putting in that at 40. Some say that we got two energy modelers. They put that number maybe over close to about 50 or 70. You know, it could be up in that higher range there. And again, coal, you still have to build the plant. So that could be maybe about $30 per megawatt hour if you're building, let's say, a $2 billion coal plant, for example. So there's a little bit of range and some uncertainty in all these numbers, but still, by and large, coal is very much cheaper. But the point is that those renewables have become more price competitive as time has gone on, probably for economies of scale or other things that may help, you know, research and development and so on. And now the disadvantages of coal, well, you got sludge. That does not look very good, and you need a lot of water just to refine the stuff, extract it, and then to cool off your plants. And then also you got air pollution, and this stuff, it's really hard to mine. It's very hazardous, right? So, and then again, that's according to BKV Energy. That's a Texas utility firm. So they have expertise in this. Now, the coal plants have contributed to a lot of deaths. I mean, that's almost 500,000 deaths from 1999 to 2020. And that's according to Harvard University, George Mason, and Texas, University of Texas, Austin. So that's a lot of hazard in that smoke pollution, those particulate matter that's getting into people's lungs. So at that rate, you know, you see like, well, okay, what about if you zoom in on just one example, right? We're going to look at Homer City, Pennsylvania. There's a coal plant nearby, and they found that these excess deaths that you're seeing here, those are attributable to coal pollution. So these are just those deaths that we're talking about. That was about 600, and it came down a little bit. But then they started to put these scrubbers on, and right there, that's when they put the scrubbers on. You see those excess deaths dwindle almost to nothing. So they were really able to clean the air. And now we're gonna pull this up, and we're gonna look at another example. Keystone, Pennsylvania, you could probably guess where they put those scrubbers in. Again, these are put on the smokestacks to clean that air. They put it in right about here, and those numbers, I mean, you had 600 annual or more excess deaths, and that's coming way down to maybe about 100. So they've really been able to make a lot of advances with this coal power in that it was able to produce energy, but not at those high costs of human life. So those are some of the pros and cons to coal that Trump wants to revitalize. Back to you.
The Department of Transportation has granted a 30-day extension to the Trump administration's order to end congestion pricing in New York City by tomorrow. Meanwhile, the governor and New York transportation leaders are vowing to continue charging the tolls. NTD's legal correspondent Arlene Richards has the latest.
The battle of authorities continues as the Trump administration's new deadline looms for New York's Metropolitan Transportation Authority, or MTA. On Friday, the MTA was supposed to stop charging drivers a peak fee of $9 from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. on weekdays and 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. on weekends. But on Thursday, Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy extended the deadline for 30 days. He said in an X post, "Your refusal to end cordon pricing and your open disrespect towards the federal government is unacceptable. Just as your high tolls and no-fee road option are a slap in the face to hardworking Americans, your refusal to approve two vital pipelines that will lower fuel costs by 50% are against the public's best interests." The charge mostly affects drivers entering Manhattan's Central Business District from 60th Street down to the southern tip of the financial district. Duffy terminated the program in a letter to Governor Kathy Hochul last month. The department and the president have said the fees are being misused. The letter cited the cost to working-class motorists and that the use of revenue from the tolls is being used for transit upgrades rather than federal roads. Governor Hochul and MTA leaders immediately filed a lawsuit to keep the system in place. Hochul has said the extra tolls will continue. Transit experts and legal observers have said that the administration might threaten to withdraw funding from other projects to gain leverage. On Tuesday, the department threatened to withhold federal funding from the MTA if it didn't respond to questions about efforts to prevent crime on the city's subways and buses. Now, Duffy says he's providing the 30-day extension as, quote, discussions continue, which seems to imply the two sides are discussing a resolution to the disagreement. If the tolls remain in place past the 30-day extension, it would be up to the administration to make the next move. It could file a lawsuit against the MTA or request a court order to force it to comply. Arlene Richards, NTD News.
Greenpeace has been ordered to pay nearly $670 million in damages to a Texas-based pipeline company over its role in protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline. A North Dakota jury sided with the company behind the pipeline, Energy Transfer. The lawsuit accused Greenpeace of funding illegal protests and spreading false claims about the project near the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. The jury found Greenpeace liable for defamation, trespassing, and conspiracy, awarding over $400 million in punitive damages. Greenpeace denies any wrongdoing, calling the case an attack on free speech and vowing to appeal. The Dakota Access Pipeline sparked fierce protests from environmental and tribal groups who warned it could contaminate local water supplies. Coming up, President Trump signs an executive order that will begin the dismantling of the Department of Education, taking a step toward fulfilling a campaign pledge. A school board member and professor of law join us to discuss the significance of Trump's latest move. And is the U.S. ceding its influence to Beijing in Southeast Asia? Experts lay out the potential consequences if the communist regime manages to gain control of the region. That and more when we return. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. President Trump signed an executive order today that begins the dismantling of the Department of Education. The White House said that key functions, including student loans, will still be administered by the department. Teachers' unions have vowed to sue over the move. Joining us now to discuss this latest development is Jenny Clark, founder of Love Your School and a member of the Arizona State Board of Education, and Dante Mills, attorney and law professor at Temple University's Beasley School of Law. Thank you both so much for joining us. Now, Jenny, starting with you, as a national school choice advocate, how significant is Trump's move today?
Well, I think the president's move today is incredibly significant, and this is exactly what he promised American families. Look, the Department of Education costs about $800 billion a year, and a lot of families feel like they are not getting what they were promised, which is a free and appropriate public education. So this is a great step in the right direction for families and for states.
And Dante, on the legal side, President Trump would still need an act of Congress to end the department fully, but his executive order directs Education Secretary Linda McMahon to do as much as she legally can to close it. Do you expect her dismantling process to face significant pushback in court?
Well, you can see they're trying to skirt the line because you can't. President Trump doesn't have the authority to completely dismantle or shut down the department because it was established by Congress. However, once it's established, there does not have to be any requirements of how large it will be or what exactly it will include or cover. We know that the Department of Education is only 4% of the United States budget. So it's not like it's this heavy burden that's weighing down our economy or really eating up a lot of our expenses or tax money. However, they feel the need to do this. On one hand, you can look at this and say, yes, we are struggling to keep up with other countries around the world in regards to our education. However, you have to keep in mind that the Department of Education provides a lot of things for people that without one centralized kind of focus won't be there. So now you're going to expect these states to regulate or set the standards as to what these students should be learning. It's going to vary throughout the country. And I think that that's going to be a problem because there may be some states where they excel and other states where they really, really fall behind. And you also talk about the impact on special needs children and people who receive benefits from the Department of Education and guidance from the Department of Education on special education that won't necessarily be there and has to be replaced somehow. So I hope that they have some contingencies in place or some things that the states can do to fill those gaps and won't just leave those students without support that they desperately need.
And Jenny, expanding on that, what exactly would in America with a smaller or closed Department of Education look like? Right now, the department, for one, offers funding to schools that meet certain requirements, like with Title IX. Should the federal government continue to have this influence over U.S. schools?
Well, I don't think so. And the bottom line is that the federal government and the Department of Education is large, bureaucratic, and completely bloated, and it has not improved outcomes in America for American school children. I mean, you're talking about $3 trillion spent since 1980. And what do we have to show for it? And I am a mom of students with disabilities. And let me just tell you, so many families are preferring school choice options like education savings accounts because we feel like we weren't getting what we need and what we were promised under IDEA in the public school system. And we know, of course, that those programs are federal law. They can be moved to other areas. But now we're going to put power and control back in the hands of the states, back in the hands of families, and back in the hands of local communities. And that is a win for American school children.
And
Well, it could be a win, right? Yeah, the issue with that is it could be a win. If you're in an area that has educated people in that area, that has wealth in that area, or high taxes in that area, where they can really stuff their schools with the necessary tools that are needed for these children to succeed. But what if you're not? What if you're in a remote area? Now what happens, because there's no body, no large governing federal body to kind of regulate what these students should learn and how they should learn and what requirements should be met. And that's the concern. There are going to be some people who flourish. There are going to be some school districts who flourish, but there's going to be some who really, really suffer because they don't have the state support, the local support, and they will no longer have the federal government support. And that's going to be a problem for a lot of children. We can't leave these children behind. Yes, school choice sounds good if you're one of the ones that can go to a better school, but what about everybody that's left in the other school? What happens to them? And that's where we need to pay attention to, because everybody deserves equal education. And that's why the federal government was involved to help that happen.
And Jenny, your response?
Well, currently the federal government is very involved, and that hasn't happened. Look, I'm really excited about the ECCA. I hope that that gets passed. That's the Educational Choice for Children federal tax credit. States like Arizona and now many others are passing school choice programs like education savings accounts, or ESAs. And we're seeing families like in Arizona flock to these programs, rural families, low-income families. Families want more choices and they want more options, and they're getting it at the state level, and now they're going to get it at the federal level. And again, that's a great thing for American families. The current system is not working.
And Jenny, staying with you, supporters, of course, welcome the move to send education authority back to the states, but critics say this will leave millions of American children behind in a system that they say is already unequal, as Dante has been pointing out. What will it take for states to ensure their students are getting the best education they can get? Can they do this without the department?
They absolutely can do it without the department because, like I said, if you look at the nation's report card, if you look at numbers like in my state and the number of children that are reading proficiently who are low income, even in a state like Arizona, it's only 16%. If you look federally, we're talking less than 30%. So the status quo and the bloated Department of Education is currently not producing education outcomes that we would say are good for American children. We can only move in the right direction with more market competition. And that's what giving families and giving local states more control of education dollars is going to provide.
And Dante,
yeah, it's just a situation where somebody will win, right? But somebody will also lose. And I think that what we have to pay attention to here is, yes, we want our systems to be better. We want to be able to compete on the world stage, but we just can't leave people behind. So how do we do that? And when you have things like an IEP, an individualized educational program, who's going to enforce that? If the federal government is now out of the picture and not mandating that these students who need services receive them. My wife teaches special needs children. She's a special needs teacher. And there are people who jockey to get into the school she's in because of what the services they provide. Now, again, the schools they're leaving don't have those services. So what do we do now when the federal government is out of the picture? So now it's going to be more of a situation where you have great schools and horrible schools because nobody's regulating to try and keep everyone above a certain level. And that's the concern that a lot of people have when you talk about school choice. When you remove all of the good fruit, all that's left is the bad fruit. And it's going to create an even worse situation. So what I would have expected is for a plan to be put in place and saying, yes, we're going to whittle down this federal agency, but we're going to replace it with this. And that's what we're not seeing. What are we going to replace it with? You want to close this department down? You think it's a good idea? Fine. But what are you replacing it with? What are those ideas? That's what I'm looking forward to hearing.
And Dante, speaking of whether or not we will see this shutdown, on the congressional side, there is a lot of division over this issue. Republican Congressman Thomas Massie is actually advocating for his bill to abolish the Department of Education. Now, he said they could use rescissions and the budget reconciliation process, which requires only 51 votes in the Senate. How likely are we to see Congress pass this?
I think we're very likely because Congress is operating on the will of the president, and probably because they should, right? He says he came in with his mandate. The Republicans won the House, the Senate, and the Oval Office. So I think they have the right to push forward their ideas, and I'm sure it's going to happen. Even if they don't completely abolish the Department of Education, they're just going to bleed it dry to where it doesn't have a function anyway. There's maybe one open office with one person sitting in there with a stapler, just so they can say that the department still exists and they can be within the law. But what I would like to see, with Congress even doing that, is some replacement ideas. And again, that's what we're not seeing. If we do, and they're good ideas, I'm all for it. But we can't just dismantle the Department of Education and then leave what? Now what's going to happen? It's just up to the states to, I guess and hope and try their best.
Well, a lot to look out for here for sure. Jenny Clark, Dante Mills, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And what do everyday Americans think about the downsizing of the Department of Education? NTD's Sam Wong was out on the National Mall in D.C. to hear from the people.
President Trump today is signing an executive order to officially begin to dismantle the Department of Education. And part of the goal is to give education back to the state. So what do you think of his move here?
I would say that, anything that will benefit kids is something I would be for. So I guess it's a wait and see game.
I think it's a wonderful idea. I think education should be in the hands of the parents and the local.
Putting it back on the states. Some of these states are terrible in education, and I worry about them.
I think the Department of Education provides vital services to ensure that American children can access quality education no matter what background they come from. I got a wonderful education from public schools, and I want every American child to have that too.
Since the formation of the Department of Education, we have gone down in the global rankings of education. I do believe that the dismantling the Department of Education and bringing it back to the states will be a long-term better choice.
Parents should be in charge of their own children's education, not the federal government. And we've seen in the past what they'll do with the monies. They'll use it for political reasons, for political purposes, and our children are suffering as a result.
So over the years, taxpayers have been pumping billions upon billions of dollars into the Department of Education, but meanwhile, our kids haven't gotten any better in terms of English proficiency or in math.
Correct.
So what do you think would be a proper solution to that? Do you think that justifies an abolishment of the Department of Education?
Yes. I think parents should have a say, and they elect local school boards. And that's where the say should be.
I do think that they need to look at what the taxpayer dollars are going towards, and that's got to go back to not just states, but local.
It's important for teachers to be compensated fairly as professionals, but also I'm sure oversight, accountability, best practices. I imagine there's a lot of ways to continue to improve so that students can perform better.
It's so important that, families are very involved in their kids' education. When I was young, we had 7 kids in our family, and you know what? My mom was home with us until I got to high school.
I would say elimination reform. Now, I don't particularly care for the reform aspect of it, just because I think it's just a little too far gone. It's time for a kind of a slash and burn technique.
Me personally, my wife and myself personally, we educated our own son at home. Put parents in charge of their education at the state level. Personally, I believe it's better to train children at home.
A hearing on Capitol Hill zeroing in on the competition between the U.S. and China for influence in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. The region is vital to America's security, but the U.S. is losing its clout there, and Beijing is making inroads. NTD's Juliette Song has more.
A headache for the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific region. At a Thursday hearing on Capitol Hill, experts say if the U.S. isn't careful, it could lose its influence in Southeast Asia to China.
The United States is recognized as the leading security provider with an unmatched alliance network. But economically, China has a nearly 2-to-1 advantage on the United States in terms of trade. It is also closing the gap on investment where American companies have led.
Why does the region matter? Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands collectively make up the 5th largest economy in the world.
They occupy strategic geography straddling these key sea lanes which connect the Indian Ocean to the Western Pacific.
The region also hosts U.S. territories, including Guam, and allies such as the Philippines and Thailand allow the U.S. military access to key naval and air bases. An expert laid out how everyday Americans would be affected if China were to gain control in the region.
That would make everyday Americans poorer. That would make everyday Americans less secure. And that would also make everyday Americans also more isolated from that sort of hub of growth and opportunity.
There's also the battle between authoritarian rule and democracy.
And now imagine the most dynamic of the region of the world looking more like China than it does the United States, or for that matter, forget the United States, Australia, Japan, any of allies and partners. That is a scary thought to imagine when you think about not just security and economics, but also democracy, human rights, media freedom, and so on and so forth.
A 2024 poll shows support for the U.S. among major Southeast Asian countries has dropped sharply. Meanwhile, China has overtaken the U.S. in Southeast Asia in trade, engagement, and infrastructure development, becoming the largest trading partner of major countries like the Philippines and Indonesia. Though behind the economic levers of influence lies Beijing's military ambition. China helped upgrade the facilities in the Ream naval base in Cambodia. Satellite images show Chinese warships docking at the base throughout most of 2024. China has also looked at ports in Malaysia that could have military applications. Beijing pitches itself as the security partner of choice for the Pacific nations.
It's offering policing initiatives, and it's offering an alternative model, if you like, of how people can be governed.
Experts commended the U.S. for offering meaningful economic engagement with the region to help pull them away from Chinese influence. Juliet Song, NTD News.
Coming up in college hoops, March Madness begins with 8 games this afternoon. Dave Martin joins us with all the scores when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Now for your sports news, we're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, a lot going on right now, especially in college hoops. So let's start there. The first round of March Madness tipped off this afternoon. What have been some of the highlights so far?
Well, the big story has been 12th-seeded McNeese State upsetting 5th-seeded Clemson 69-67. This is their first ever tournament victory. They led by a huge margin. They were up 24 points at one point in the second half. Clemson actually made a huge run to cut it to too late. It was not quite enough, though, so congratulations to McNeese. They'll face Purdue Saturday. Now, the Boilermakers beat High Point this afternoon 75-63 to advance to the second round as well. Now, elsewhere, a 3rd seed Wisconsin beat Montana 85-66. Badgers will face BYU next after BYU beat Virginia Commonwealth 80-71. We also have in the South region, Creighton topped Louisville 89-75. They move on to face Auburn next. Top seeded Auburn actually beat Alabama State by 20 points this afternoon as expected. And in the Midwest region, Houston blew out SIU Edwardsville 78-40. They will face the winner of Georgia Gonzaga next. Now, Gonzaga was up 24 points with 2 minutes remaining last I saw, so I'm going to assume that they won the game.
Well, a lot of numbers. They're moving to NBA news. The Boston Celtics are being sold for a whopping $6.1 billion. Where does that price tag rank in NBA history?
You know, it's not only number one in NBA history, it's the highest price tag in North American sports franchise history. $6.1 million, that's just over the $6.05 billion that the Washington Commanders were sold for 2023. Now, the new ownership group, led by William Chisholm, he's the managing partner of Symphony Technology Group based in California. And in his statement, though, he says he grew up in the New England area, has been a diehard Celtics fan his entire life. Now, even though he'll be purchasing the team, as part of the deal, the current owner, Wyc Grousbeck, will stay on as CEO and governor for the next 3 years. That's good news for Celtics fans. This guy has been very successful there. He brought the team in 2002 for $360 million. They've won 2 NBA titles since. They could be in line for a 3rd one this summer. So he's had a very successful tenure, and now he's pretty rich.
Well, looking at Olympic news, the IOC elected Kirsty Coventry as the new president. What can you tell us about her?
Yeah, she's a former Olympic swimmer from Zimbabwe. She actually won back-to-back gold medals in the 200-meter backstroke 2004 and 2008. She's won 7 Olympic medals overall. That's actually the most from anyone in all of Africa. Now, she was Thomas Bach's protege. Now, Bach, of course, the former president of the IOC. I'm sure that helped her. Bach is stepping down this summer, of course, after 12 years in charge. Now, certainly, she's got some challenges ahead. I mean, the transgender athletes in sports has obviously been a hot button issue. There's also been some doping scandals that I think has made a lot of distrust among the athletes. And of course, they still need to find a host for the 2036 Summer Games. NBC, of course, has already agreed to air those. So plenty of work to be done. She's got an 8-year commitment, though, as president.
Well, tonight, the first round of the NCAA tournament continues with 8 more games. Now, what do you think are some of the best matchups on paper anyway?
Well, I think Arkansas versus Kansas is going to be a watch game, by a lot of people. Not because either team is expected to win the titles, but because both these coaches are Hall of Fame coaches. John Calipari, Bill Self. In fact, this is the 3rd time these two have met in the NCAA tournament. The first 2 were both in the title game. Now, Self's KU beat Calipari's Memphis squad in 2008 for the title. Calipari returned the favor 4 years later when he was at Kentucky, winning the title there. That game starts very soon, or 7:10 Eastern time. I also think Drake versus Missouri is going to be a good one. Now, Drake is 11th seed. They've got a stellar 30-3 record, though. They are a popular pick to upset Missouri, and this game is played in Wichita, Kansas, not far from either campus. And one more, we got Yale versus Texas A&M. Only because Yale is a 13th seed. They won last year, beating Auburn in the first round, shocked everyone. Maybe they do it again. So that could be a good game. I mean, nobody wants to lose to an Ivy League school, of course, in the NCAA tournament. So that could be one people are watching, if it's close.
Still looking for that Cinderella. Well, Davis, always thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tiff.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com/live or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.